The afternoon heat sat heavy on the town of Oakhaven, pressing down on the wooden sidewalks and baking the alkaline dust into a fine, choking powder. Inside the office of the territorial marriage broker, the air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, dried ink, and the sour sweat of men who spent their days digging in the unforgiving earth. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner, a slow, methodical heartbeat in the stifling, airless room. Through the thin wall separating the office from the saloon next door came the muffled sounds of clinking glasses and rough voices. It was a Tuesday. The stagecoach had arrived that morning, bringing a handful of weary travelers and 3 women looking for husbands among the miners and ranchers. 2 had already been matched, their futures sealed with a quick signature and a handshake. Then the front door opened. The brass bell above it did not merely ring, it clattered, startled by the sudden intrusion. The harsh glare of the midday sun spilled into the dim room, casting a long, dark shadow across the floorboards. The man who stepped inside brought the scent of the high country with him. Crushed pine needles, wood smoke, and the clean, sharp bite of mountain air seemed to roll off his broad shoulders. He wore a heavy canvas duster dusted with the red dirt of the ridge, and high riding boots that had seen miles of jagged rock. His dark hair was tied back, and his skin was weathered to the color of old copper. He was Apache. The town called him John, a name forced upon him by a census taker years ago, but those who respected the silence of the mountains knew him by the land he worked. He walked to the broker's desk with a deliberate, unhurried stride. Every movement was precise, carrying the quiet, coiled strength of a man who fought the earth for everything he owned. The broker, a soft man named Miller, with a nervous habit of wiping his brow, stopped writing. The scratch of his pen ceased, leaving only the slow ticking of the clock. Miller swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the open door that led to the saloon. The homesteader reached into his coat and withdrew a heavy leather pouch. He placed it on the scarred oak desk. The clinking of gold coins inside was unmistakable. The sound cut through the silence like a gunshot. "I am here for a wife," the man said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, calm and steady. "I have 160 acres on High Ridge. I need a woman to help work the claim." Miller stared at the pouch, then up at the man. A nervous, high-pitched chuckle escaped his lips. The sound carried through the open saloon door. A few men drifted over, leaning against the doorframe, their faces flushed with cheap whiskey and boredom. "A wife?" Miller repeated, his voice gaining confidence as the audience gathered. "You want a wife from the agency." One of the saloon men barked a laugh. It was a harsh, scraping sound. "Did you hear that, boys? The Indian wants a white bride to drag up to that pile of rocks he calls a farm." The laughter spread, infectious and cruel. It bounced off the walls, a rising tide of mockery. Men shoved each other, pointing, their faces twisting in ugly amusement. They mocked the dirt on his boots. They mocked the idea of a woman surviving a week on the desolate ridge. They threw their insults like stones, trying to break the heavy, stoic calm of the man standing at the desk. He did not flinch. He did not turn to face his tormentors. His dark eyes remained fixed on the broker, his posture straight, his hands resting loose and relaxed at his sides. He let the laughter wash over him, as indifferent to it as a mountain is to a passing storm. He had survived winter blizzards, drought, and the slow grinding isolation of the frontier. The noise of small men meant nothing, but the laughter grew louder, filling the small room, threatening to drown out the ticking clock. Miller smirked, sliding the pouch of coins back toward the edge of the desk. "I am sorry," Miller said, his upper lip curling into a sneer. "I do not think any woman here is desperate enough to follow you up to the ridge. You had best take your money and buy a good mule instead." The saloon men roared. The joke was complete. The entertainment was over. Then a sound cut through the uproar. It was not a shout. It was the simple, heavy scrape of a wooden chair pushing back across the floorboards in the far corner of the room. The laughter faltered. Heads turned. From the shadows near the stove, a woman stood up. Her name was Eleanor. She wore a faded blue calico dress mended at the elbows and sturdy leather boots that had walked too many miles of hard road. She was not a young, blushing girl. The frontier had etched its story around her eyes, leaving lines of exhaustion and a quiet, unyielding sorrow. Her hands resting in front of her were rough and calloused from years of scrubbing floors and tending fires for families that were not her own. She stepped forward. Her gaze did not dart nervously to the men in the doorway. She did not look at the sweating broker. She looked intently at the tall man standing by the desk. The room went dead silent. The town drunk stopped mid-laugh, his mouth hanging open. Miller half rose from his seat. Eleanor stopped a few feet from the homesteader. He turned his head slowly, acknowledging her presence. Their eyes met. There was no pity in her gaze and no apology in his. It was the steady, appraising look of two people who knew the exact weight of a hard life. The town waited for her to speak. They waited for her to join the joke, to tell the man to leave or to turn away in fear. Eleanor took a breath. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it possessed a strange, resonant clarity that commanded the room. "Is there water on the claim?" she asked. The question hung in the dusty air. It was a practical, utterly serious question. It was the question of a woman who understood that romance did not keep a person alive through a winter drought, but a good well might. In those 6 words, she silenced the saloon, the broker, and the cruel amusement of the town. She validated him not as a curiosity, but as a man, a farmer, a partner in survival. The man held her gaze. The subtle tightening of his jaw was the only sign that the question had moved him. The shadows in his dark eyes seemed to shift, revealing a flicker of profound respect. A deep spring, he answered, his voice matching her quiet gravity. It flows through the bedrock. It never freezes over, even in the deepest winter. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment. She saw the dust on his coat, the strength in his hands, and the unwavering truth in his eyes. She saw a man who would not break when the wind howled. She gave a single firm nod. "Then tell Mr. Miller to write the paper," she said. "I am accustomed to hard work, and I do not mind the cold." She turned to the broker, who was staring at them as if they had spoken in a foreign tongue. "Well," Eleanor demanded, her tone leaving no room for argument, "I believe the gentleman has paid the fee. Draft the contract." Miller fumbled for his pen, his hands shaking so badly he knocked over his inkwell. The men in the doorway slowly backed away, their cruel smiles replaced by a stunned, uncomfortable silence. The theater of mockery had been shattered by the sheer, undeniable force of a woman's resolve. As the pen scratched across the parchment, sealing their lives together in a few quick strokes, the man and the quiet woman stood side by side. They did not touch. They did not speak words of comfort, but in the space between them, a foundation had been poured. Stronger than the town's hatred, heavier than the gold on the desk. It was a silent promise forged in the dust of a room that would never forget the day the town laughed, and a single question silenced them all. The iron-rimmed wheels of the buckboard wagon cut deep, unyielding tracks into the dry earth as they left the town of Oakhaven behind. There was no grand farewell, no cheerful chorus of well-wishes from the folks who crowded the wooden sidewalks. The townspeople stood like silent sentinels under the shop awnings, their faces tight with a mixture of scorn and morbid curiosity. They watched the Apache homesteader and his new bride ride toward the jagged western horizon, fully expecting the harsh frontier to swallow them whole. Eleanor sat stiffly on the hard wooden bench of the wagon, her hands folded neatly over a worn, faded carpet bag that held everything she owned in the world. She did not look back over her shoulder. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, locked on the rising foothills that baked beneath the merciless, white-hot glare of the afternoon sun. The town and its laughter were already fading into ghosts, replaced by the crushing, undeniable reality of the open country. The road out of the valley was barely a road at all. It was nothing more than a pair of scarred rocky ruts winding through an endless ocean of pale sagebrush and brittle mesquite. The heat was a living, breathing thing. It radiated from the sheer canyon walls and rose in shimmering, distorted waves off the muscular backs of the 2 sturdy mules pulling the wagon. Fine alkaline dust coated everything. It settled into the deep creases of Eleanor's calico dress, powdered the dark brim of the man's hat, and coated the inside of their throats with a dry, chalky taste. It was a brutal, rhythmic journey. The constant jarring sway of the wagon bed, the sharp creak of the leather harness, and the steady grinding crunch of iron wheels on loose stone created a hypnotic cadence. This rhythm filled the heavy, expansive silence between the man and the woman. They had exchanged vows on a piece of cheap paper, but out here words felt useless. The land demanded silence. He drove with a loose, expert grip on the heavy leather reins. He did not urge the mules to a frantic, energy-wasting pace, nor did he let them slacken their steady march. He read the treacherous terrain with the ease of a man reading the worn pages of a familiar book, guiding the heavy wagon over deep washouts and half-buried boulders with subtle, almost imperceptible shifts of his strong wrists. Every so often, from beneath the deep shadow of his hat brim, his dark eyes would flick toward the woman sitting beside him. He expected the complaints. He expected the heavy sighs of exhaustion, the nervous weeping of a town woman, suddenly terrified by the sheer overwhelming scale of the empty world. He had seen strong men break under the weight of this isolation. But Eleanor gave him nothing of the sort. She absorbed the violent jolts of the wagon without a single murmur of discontent. When the iron wheels struck a hidden pothole, throwing the wagon violently to the side and nearly pitching her from the seat, she simply tightened her pale grip on the iron side rail, righted her posture, and calmly smoothed her dusty skirts. Her profile seemed carved from pale stone against the bright bleeding sky. She was reading the land just as he was, though with different eyes. She saw the absolute isolation, the miles of empty broken rock, where a scream would echo against the canyon walls and die entirely unheard. Yet her steady, even breathing never hitched. In her quiet, uncomplaining endurance, he recognized a fierce survival instinct that perfectly matched his own. Mid-afternoon brought them to the base of the long, grueling grade that led up into the timberline of High Ridge. He pulled back firmly on the reins, bringing the sweating team to a halt beneath the sparse, fragmented shade of an ancient, twisted juniper tree. He tied off the leathers and stepped down from the wagon in one fluid, silent motion. Without a word, he unhooked a heavy canvas canteen from the side rail and unscrewed the metal cap. He did not drink first. He walked around to her side of the wagon, stepping over a patch of prickly pear, and held the heavy canteen up to her. Eleanor looked down at the offered water, then lifted her gaze to meet his eyes. There was no subservience in his gesture, only the practical, essential courtesy of a partner, ensuring the strength of his team. She took the canteen, her rough fingers briefly brushing the sun-warmed canvas. The water was tepid, tasting faintly of tin and wet earth, but as it washed the dust from her throat, it was the sweetest thing she had ever swallowed. She drank her fill, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and handed the vessel back down to him. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was scratchy from the trail dust, but perfectly steady. He nodded once, drank deeply himself, and stowed the canteen. Before climbing back onto the driver's seat, he reached into the bed of the wagon and pulled free a thick, heavy woven wool blanket. He shook the pale dust from it and placed it on the wooden bench where she sat, folding it over twice to create a thick cushion against the unforgiving, bone-rattling ride. He did not ask if she was sore. He did not make a grand, polite production of his care. He simply saw a physical hardship and quietly, efficiently fixed it. Eleanor watched his hands, large and capable and deeply scarred, smooth the heavy wool, a strange tight knot in her chest, a heavy knot of defensiveness she had carried for years, loosened by a single fraction of an inch. The final ascent was grueling. The air grew noticeably thinner, rapidly losing the baked dead heat of the valley floor and taking on the sharp, clean, biting chill of the high country. The pale desert sagebrush finally gave way to towering ponderosa pines, their rough, armored bark glowing like deep red embers in the late afternoon light. The rich scent of crushed pine needles, cold stone, and damp mountain earth completely replaced the choking smell of alkaline dust. The shadows stretched long and purple across the mountain trail, plunging the deep ravines on either side of them into sudden cold darkness. As the sun finally touched the jagged rim of the western mountains, painting the massive sky in violent streaks of bruised violet ash, gray and burning gold, the wagon crested the final steep rise. The land leveled out into a broad, sweeping plateau bordered by a dense, impenetrable wall of dark timber. In the center of the clearing, small and defiant against the vastness of the darkening sky, sat a cabin built of thick, hand-peeled logs. Smoke drifted lazily from a sturdy stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon spelling out the quiet promise of warmth in the rapidly cooling air. He pulled the mules to a final heavy stop. The sudden absence of the wagon's constant motion was jarring, leaving only the profound sound of the evening wind, sighing through the upper branches of the ancient pines. He turned his head to her, gesturing with one leather-gloved hand toward the dark cabin and the rough acres of cleared, fenced land surrounding it. It was harsh. It was terribly isolated. It was entirely theirs. "This is the place," he said, his low voice carrying perfectly in the twilight stillness. Eleanor looked at the sturdy, weather-beaten walls, the high stacks of split cordwood, and the deep, silent woods beyond. She drew in a long, slow breath of the freezing mountain air, letting it fill her lungs. "We have an hour of daylight left," she replied, setting her carpet bag firmly onto the floorboards. Show me where the water is." The rhythm of High Ridge was not measured by the delicate ticking of a clock, but by the relentless arc of the mountain sun and the deep, undeniable ache that settled into their bones by nightfall. There was no space in the high country for the soft, hesitant courtship of the valley towns. Survival was a jealous master, demanding every ounce of their waking energy. The work stripped away any pretense, leaving only the raw, unpolished truth of who they were. Their mornings began long before the first gray light bled over the eastern peaks. The cabin, though built tight and chinked with heavy clay, surrendered to the bitter chill of the mountain night. Eleanor would wake in the pitch black beneath a heavy mountain of wool quilts. Her breath plumed in the freezing air, a pale ghost in the darkness. But when she finally pushed the blankets aside and set her bare feet upon the icy wooden floorboards, she never had to face the morning entirely alone. She would walk to the cast-iron stove, occupying the center of the main room, her arms wrapped tightly around her shivering shoulders. There she would find the daily evidence of a quiet, steadfast devotion. He was already gone, having slipped from the cabin like a shadow to tend the livestock, but he had left a silent greeting behind. The heavy iron door of the stove would be cracked open just an inch. Inside the firebox, resting on a bed of warm gray ashes from the night before, a perfect pyramid of dry pine shavings and split kindling sat ready and waiting. He did not just throw the wood in carelessly. The arrangement was precise, engineered to catch the smallest spark and immediately roar to life. Beside the stove, 2 heavy wooden buckets sat brimming to the rim with fresh freezing water drawn from the deep spring. Eleanor never had to ask for the water. She never had to wander out into the biting wind to chop her own morning wood. He simply understood the punishing nature of her domestic labor and removed the heaviest burdens before she even opened her eyes. She would strike a lucifer match, touch the sulfur flame to the pine shavings, and watch the fire devour the wood. As the golden light spilled across the rough-hewn floorboards and the radiant heat began to push the winter chill back into the corners of the room, she felt a profound, grounding sense of security she had never known in her entire life. In return, Eleanor spoke her own silent language of iron and fire. While he was out breaking the frozen earth and mending the perimeter fences against the encroaching wilderness, she transformed the stark, empty cabin into a fortress against the world. She learned the specific heavy cadence of his footsteps on the porch. Long before he pushed the heavy timber door open, she would have the heavy cast-iron skillet hissing on the stovetop. When he stepped inside bringing the sharp biting scent of crushed pine needles, horse sweat, and cold mountain dirt with him, he was met by the thick, savory aroma of frying salt, pork-hot sourdough biscuits, and black boiling coffee. They ate their meals at the rough plank table in a comfortable, heavy silence. They did not fill the space with idle chatter about the weather or the past. They communicated in the passing of a plate, the pouring of a second cup of coffee, without being asked, and the steady grounding presence of another human being anchoring the other side of the room. He ate with the focused, quiet intensity of a man who viewed food as necessary fuel, but he always left the last best piece of meat in the center of the iron skillet for her. It was a tiny, easily missed gesture, but Eleanor saw it every time. She saw the rough, dirt-stained hands that moved mountains of stone all day, consciously pausing to ensure she was provided for. The true depth of their partnership settled over the cabin in the evenings. When the sun dipped below the jagged rim of the canyon and the temperature plummeted, the world outside simply ceased to exist. The wind would begin its nightly howling, throwing itself against the solid log walls like a wild animal, trying to find a way inside. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and kerosene. A single glass lamp sat in the center of the table, casting a warm, flickering pool of yellow light. Eleanor would sit in the rocking chair by the stove, a heavy wicker basket resting at her feet. She took his heavy canvas duster, the coat that served as his only armor against the brutal elements, and stretched it across her lap. The canvas was stiff with dried mud, worn thin at the elbows and torn by the vicious thorns of the brush he cleared. She threaded a thick steel needle with heavy waxed thread. Her hands rough and calloused from the lye soap, and the iron stove worked with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. She pulled the heavy thread through the unyielding canvas, binding the torn edges together with tight, perfect stitches. She did not just patch the coat. She reinforced the seams, fortifying the fabric against the next day's punishment. She poured her fierce, quiet determination into every pull of the needle, stitching her protection into the very fibers that kept him warm. Across the room he would sit on a low wooden stool, a whetstone in one hand, and his heavy steel felling axe in the other. The rhythmic metallic scrape of the stone against the iron blade filled the small room, a steady heartbeat that matched the pulling of her thread. He would pause, wiping the gleaming blade with an oiled rag, and look up across the dim room. He watched the way the kerosene light caught the loose strands of her hair. He watched the capable, unhesitating movement of her hands. He saw the strength it took to sit in the absolute isolation of the ridge and not be broken by it. He did not offer flowery declarations. He did not cross the room to speak promises into the dark. Instead, he tested the edge of his axe with his thumb, satisfied that it was sharp enough to cut the wood that would keep her warm, and went back to his work. In the language of the frontier, where words were cheap and easily blown away by the wind, they were building a towering, unshakable monument to one another out of firewood, hot iron, and heavy waxed thread. The warning did not come as a sound, but as a sudden heavy absence of one. Late in the afternoon, the constant sighing breeze through the ponderosa pines simply stopped. The air grew completely still, taking on a strange metallic density that tasted of iron and crushed ice. Above the jagged western peaks, the pale autumn sky bruised a deep unnatural violet, then rapidly thickened into a solid, suffocating wall of lead-gray clouds. Eleanor was standing on the front porch, shaking the dust from a heavy woven rug, when she felt the first unnatural drop in temperature. It was not the crisp, familiar chill of evening. It was a vicious, biting cold that sliced right through the thick cotton of her dress and sank directly into her bones. She looked out toward the tree line and saw him. He was not walking with his usual steady, deliberate pace. He was moving with a sudden, rigid urgency, dropping the heavy wooden maul beside the chopping block and sprinting toward the animal pens. No words were exchanged across the frozen yard. None were needed. Eleanor dropped the rug and ran toward the woodpile. The first flakes of snow did not drift from the sky. They were driven sideways, hard and dry as desert sand, stinging her cheeks and catching in her eyelashes. The wind returned with a sudden deafening roar, a physical force that nearly knocked her off her feet. It swept down from the high peaks, howling through the canyons like a starving animal. Eleanor gathered as much split cordwood as her arms could possibly hold, ignoring the rough splinters tearing at her skin. She carried the heavy load to the porch, dumped it against the cabin wall, and turned back for more. The temperature was plummeting by the minute, turning the damp earth of the yard into solid iron. Through the thickening whiteout, she saw him hauling the heavy wooden barn doors open. The mules were already stamping and pulling at their tethers, their eyes wide with the primal fear of the incoming blizzard. He muscled the reluctant animals inside his broad shoulders, leaning hard against the blinding wind. Eleanor made 3 more trips to the woodpile, her breath tearing through her lungs in ragged white plumes. By her 4th trip, the cabin was barely visible from the edge of the clearing. The world had dissolved into a violent, churning vortex of blinding white. Suddenly, a heavy hand caught her arm. He materialized from the swirling snow, his heavy canvas duster, completely plastered in white. He took the towering stack of firewood from her freezing arms, shifting the entire load against his own chest with effortless strength. He grabbed her hand with his free one, his grip tight and unyielding through the thick leather of his work glove. He did not let go. He pulled her through the roaring whiteout, using his own body as a shield to break the punishing force of the wind. They stumbled up the wooden steps of the porch together, kicking the heavy timber door open and shoving it shut against the raging storm with their combined weight. He threw the heavy iron bolt into place, sealing them inside. The sudden silence within the cabin was deafening. Outside, the wind screamed and tore at the log walls, a relentless, terrifying assault. But inside, the thick mud chinking and the heavy timber held fast. They stood in the center of the dim room, panting heavily, chests heaving in perfect unison. Puddles of melting snow began to pool around their boots, soaking into the rough floorboards. He dropped the massive load of firewood into the heavy iron box beside the stove. Then he turned to her. His face was flushed from the brutal cold, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with melting snow. His chest rose and fell with heavy rhythmic breaths. Eleanor stood frozen, her entire body trembling violently from the adrenaline and the bitter, shocking cold. Her hands were tucked tightly under her arms, her lips pale and completely numb. He did not turn away to tend the fire. He stepped across the small space separating them. The vast empty distance they usually kept between each other in the cabin vanished in a single stride. He reached out and took hold of her trembling shoulders. His hands were heavy and solid, grounding her shaking frame. Slowly, with a surprising, deliberate gentleness, he began to unbutton the top of her soaked, freezing coat. Eleanor did not pull away. She stood perfectly still, looking up into his dark, storm-colored eyes. The fierce, untouchable isolation that always surrounded him was gone, replaced by a focused, burning intensity. He slipped the heavy, wet wool from her shoulders, letting it fall with a heavy thud to the floorboards. Then he took her freezing hands in his. He pulled off his own soaked leather work gloves, with his teeth tossing them aside, and enveloped her small, icy fingers in his large, calloused palms. His skin was incredibly warm, radiating a deep furnace-like heat. He rubbed her hands briskly, his thumbs tracing the rough working calluses on her palms, willing his own warmth directly into her bones. The stove in the corner hissed and popped as stray drops of water hit the hot iron, but the true heat in the room was blooming right in the center of the floor. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was a low, rough whisper, completely devoid of its usual stoic distance. "No," Eleanor breathed. Her voice trembled, but not from the cold. He kept his hands wrapped tightly around hers, stepping even closer. The claustrophobic warmth of the cabin, the roaring darkness of the storm outside, and the sudden overwhelming proximity of his body created a heavy hypnotic gravity. She could smell the cold mountain wind trapped in his clothes mixed with the scent of wood smoke and raw, undeniable strength. For weeks they had communicated only through firewood-patched coats and shared labor. They had built a fortress against the world, but they had built it on opposite sides of the room. Now trapped in the eye of the storm, the walls they had maintained between themselves finally crumbled. Eleanor slowly pulled one hand free from his grip. She reached up her fingers, trembling slightly, and brushed a wet strand of dark hair away from his eyes. Her thumb rested against the warm, weathered line of his jaw. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, leaning into her touch with a heavy, unspoken surrender. When he opened them again, the quiet devotion that had lived only in his actions was fully present in his gaze. He moved his hands from her fingers to her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. Outside, the frontier raged and howled, threatening to bury them alive beneath the snow. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the fierce protective heat of the fire they had built together, the last of the silence finally broke. Winter broke not with a sudden rush of warmth, but with the slow dripping surrender of the ice. The heavy drifts that had buried High Ridge for 4 brutal months began to recede, leaving behind a landscape of raw black mud and the sharp, clean scent of wet pine. The creek that cut through the lower pasture swelled its voice, rising from a muffled gurgle beneath the ice to a roaring, muddy torrent. Inside the cabin, the heavy claustrophobia of the long freeze lifted. They opened the thick timber door to let the sharp spring breeze sweep away the stale smell of wood smoke and kerosene. The silence between them was no longer the cautious, measured quiet of strangers. It was the comfortable, deep stillness of 2 roots tangled firmly beneath the hard soil. He spent his days mending the fences the snowdrifts had crushed, the rhythmic ringing of his hammer blows echoing sharply across the valley. She worked the small patch of earth near the porch, her hands buried in the cold, damp soil, coaxing the early seeds of a vegetable garden to take hold. The intrusion came on a Tuesday, carried on the damp afternoon wind. It started as a low, rhythmic vibration in the earth, a steady thrumming that interrupted the quiet isolation of the ridge. He was near the barn, a heavy coil of barbed wire resting against his leather-chapped leg, when he stopped and turned his head toward the valley trail. He dropped the wire, his jaw tightened into a hard, unforgiving line. Eleanor, kneeling by the porch with a wooden trowel in her hand, saw the sudden shift in his posture. She stood up, wiping the wet dirt from her hands onto her heavy canvas apron. Up from the muddy trail rode a half-dozen men. Their horses were lathered and blowing hard from the steep, punishing climb. Leading the pack was Miller, the marriage broker, his soft face flushed and sweating beneath the brim of his bowler hat. But flanking him were the men from the saloon, the same men who had filled the dusty office with their cruel, scraping laughter months ago. They wore sidearms strapped low on their hips, their expressions twisted with a false, manufactured sense of righteous duty. They had come to the ridge expecting a tragedy. They had come expecting a frozen grave or a weeping, broken woman begging to be returned to the civilized world. He did not run toward the cabin. He did not shout for her to hide inside. He walked with his slow, deliberate stride toward the center of the muddy yard, placing himself squarely between the approaching riders and the front porch. He did not draw the heavy revolver at his hip, nor did he reach for the Winchester rifle leaning against the chopping block. He simply stood there, his broad shoulders squared in a movable mountain of muscle canvas and quiet defiance. He was the Apache they had mocked, the Homesteader they had bet against, and he had claimed this mountain. The riders pulled their heavy mounts to a halt a few yards away. The horses stamped and snorted their hooves, churning the soft black mud. "Well," Miller called out, his voice thin and nervous in the vast open air, "I see the winter did not kill you after all, John." He did not answer. He merely stared at the broker with eyes as cold and dark as flint. "We came for the woman." One of the saloon men sneered, resting his hand casually on the butt of his pistol. "We figured she had enough of starving on a rock with a savage. Send her out. We are taking her back to town." The heavy scrape of boots on the wooden porch boards cut through the tense, humid air. Eleanor stepped down into the mud. She did not cower behind his broad back. She walked out to stand perfectly level with him, their shoulders almost brushing. She held the dirt-stained wooden trowel loosely in her hand, her posture straight, her chin raised. She looked at the men, her eyes sweeping over their muddy boots, their nervous horses, and their arrogant, foolish faces. "I am exactly where I chose to be," Eleanor said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute ringing clarity of a struck anvil. Miller shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his horse stepping sideways. "Now, Eleanor, there is no need to be frightened. We came all this way to rescue you." "Rescue me?" Eleanor repeated. The faint trace of a cold, bitter smile touched the corner of her mouth. "You came to satisfy your own cruel curiosity. You came to see if we had failed." She stepped half a pace forward, the mud sucking at her heavy boots. She pointed the wooden trowel toward the valley. "There is nothing in that town for me but scrubbing floors and swallowing your mockery." She continued, her voice gaining a fierce, rising power. "Here I have a home. Here I have a fire that never goes out, water from a deep spring, and a man who works the earth until his hands bleed, so that I do not have to." She turned her head slightly, her gaze softening for a fraction of a second as it met the dark, unwavering eyes of her husband before snapping back to the riders with the force of a whip. "He is 10 times the man any of you will ever be. You will turn your horses around, Mr. Miller. You will ride back down that mountain, and you will never set foot on our land again." The silence that followed was absolute. The saloon men looked at each other, the sneers melting off their faces replaced by a dull, burning shame. They had expected a victim. They had found a queen defending her fortress. Without a single word, Miller pulled his horse around. The others followed their departure, lacking all the bluster and noise of their arrival. They rode back down the muddy trail, shrinking until they were nothing but ghosts, swallowed by the vast, indifferent timber. Eleanor stood watching the empty trail, her chest heaving, the heavy wooden trowel trembling slightly in her grip. Then, a heavy, warm hand settled gently over hers, entirely covering her muddy fingers. She looked up into his face. He did not speak. He did not need to. The profound, overwhelming pride in his eyes was the only language she would ever need. The sound of the retreating horses faded into the vast, swallowing expanse of the ponderosa pines. The valley slowly reclaimed its ancient, unbroken silence. Eleanor stood in the center of the muddy yard, her chest rising and falling with the fading adrenaline of her defiance. Beside her, the man who had bought her a lifetime of freedom, with a pouch of gold and a quiet promise, remained perfectly still. He did not celebrate. He did not boast. He simply watched the empty trail until he was absolutely certain the intrusion was gone forever. Down in the valley, the town of Oakhaven would continue its small, noisy existence. They would trade gossip over cheap whiskey and measure a man's worth by the softness of his hands and the volume of his voice. But up here, where the air was thin and the stone was hard, those rules held no power. The laughter of the town had finally been silenced, replaced by the heavy, undeniable truth of what they had built together. He turned his head and looked at her. The harsh lines of his weathered face, usually carved from impenetrable stone, had softened completely. He looked at the heavy black mud coating her boots, the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw, and the wooden gardening trowel still gripped tightly in her pale hand. In her, he saw the perfect mirror of his own relentless spirit. He saw a woman who had looked directly into the abyss of the untamed frontier and utterly refused to blink. He reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and gently pried the wooden trowel from her tense fingers. He tossed it lightly onto the porch boards. Then he lifted his large, calloused hand and cupped the side of her face. His rough thumb traced the sharp line of her cheekbone, gently wiping away a stray streak of damp mountain earth. The touch was completely stripped of urgency. It was a gesture of profound, overwhelming reverence. The afternoon surrendered to the golden hour, casting long, magnificent shadows across the cleared land. The harsh, blinding light of midday mellowed into a rich, liquid amber that painted the heavy log cabin in warm, glowing tones. They did not retreat indoors to rest. The land still required their hands, and there was a deep, grounding comfort to be found in the familiar, steady rhythm of their shared labor. They moved together to the garden plot she had been so fiercely defending. The soil was dark, rich, and heavy with the promise of the spring thaw. He fetched a heavy iron hoe from the barn, his broad shoulders swaying with that easy, hypnotic grace he carried. He began to break the tougher clods of damp earth, preparing the straight rows for the seeds she carried in the deep pockets of her canvas apron. They worked side by side in a profound, comfortable quiet. The metallic bite of the iron hoe striking the earth, and the soft, dry rustle of seeds falling into the damp soil created a gentle symphony of survival. The distance between them, once measured by the vast expanse of a hostile saloon and the terrifying width of a freezing winter cabin, had completely vanished. They moved around each other with an effortless, unspoken choreography. When she needed to step forward to press the soil over a planted row, he naturally stepped back, leaning his weight casually on the wooden handle of the hoe just to watch her. She felt the heavy, warm weight of his gaze. It was no longer the appraising look of a man measuring a partner for winter endurance. It was the steady burning light of a man who had finally found his harbor. She looked up from the dark soil, wiping the faint sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, and offered him a small, rare smile. It was not a grand theatrical expression. It was a quiet, fiercely private offering meant entirely for him. He returned it with a slow, deep nod, the corners of his dark eyes crinkling against the fading golden sunlight. In the silent language of High Ridge, that single simple exchange was a soaring, triumphant declaration of absolute love. As the sun finally dipped below the jagged rim of the western mountains, the massive sky ignited in a brilliant, violent canvas of bruised purple burning orange and deep cooling ash. The sharp chill of the mountain evening returned, carrying the fresh, clean scent of wet pine needles and melting snow down from the higher peaks. He put the iron tools away and walked to the heavy cast-iron water pump. He worked the handle, the rhythmic squeak echoing across the quiet yard, and washed the dark earth from his hands and arms. Eleanor stood waiting on the wooden porch, holding a thick woven wool blanket. When he finished, he walked up the wooden steps. He did not go inside the cabin. He stopped right beside her, turning his gaze out over the vast, sweeping plateau they had carved from the merciless wilderness. The valley below was already drowning in deep, impenetrable shadows, but up on the ridge, the last beautiful light of the day still held on. Eleanor unfolded the heavy wool blanket and draped it over his broad shoulders, pulling the edges snug against his chest to ward off the biting wind. Then she stepped into his side. He lifted his arm, wrapping it tightly around her waist, and pulled her flush against the warmth of his heavy canvas coat. She rested her head against his shoulder, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the tough fabric. They stood together at the very edge of the world. They had survived the bitter, killing frost. They had survived the mocking, arrogant laughter of cruel men. They had taken the hardest, most unforgiving piece of earth and watered it with their sweat, their silent devotion, and their unyielding grit. They had built an impenetrable fortress, not just of log and stone, but of mutual respect and quiet, profound love. The wind sighed heavily through the upper branches of the ancient pines, a soft, mournful sound that no longer held any terror. It was simply the voice of their home, singing them into the falling night. They needed no words to understand the absolute perfection of the moment. The silence was complete, and it was entirely theirs. As the first silver stars began to pierce the darkening sky over High Ridge, leaving the Stoic homesteader and his quiet bride to the peace they so fiercely earned, one cannot help but reflect on the heavy cost of true devotion. Eleanor chose the harsh, demanding reality of the mountains over the cruel, judgmental safety of the town, and in doing so found a love spoken entirely without words. Such quiet, unyielding strength is rare in a noisy world. If you found yourself moved by Eleanor's courage or by the silent, steadfast protection of the man who stood by her side, please share your thoughts on their journey in the comments below. Tell me which of their unspoken moments resonated with you the most, and let their story echo just a little longer.